But we had a really hard week, didn't we, this week? As a country who witnessed again, all too frequently, another rampage, another shooting at a college campus, Umpqua Community College in Roseburg, Oregon. You've seen the news. It's just hard to believe if it wasn't happening so frequently. 10 or actually 9 people killed, plus the killer himself, killed himself. Shooter. Another 10 or so more wounded. Just unexplainable violence. And we look at that, and when you think about not only the previous school shootings, and we can name them all. When you think of that, when you think of the violence in our cities, Ferguson, Baltimore, you think of gun violence in Chicago, and you recognize there's something broken deep in the soul of our country. It really is. There's something deeply broken in our country. And it's something that's deeper than any gun law debate will ever be able to solve. It's deeper than that. It's broken at the level of our country, indeed the whole world. There's something broken moving from our country to our cities, from our cities to our neighborhoods. And so we have, over the last several weeks, been introducing you to the goal for the year, something that we're going to be focusing on throughout the entire year. And we've called it basically the idea of trying to play out, trying to actually put into practice this principle that Jesus gives us in the New Testament. Because all of the laws that are really designed, that are given to us by God, God's laws that were to try to regulate human behavior and minimize destructive behavior toward each other, the New Testament says that all of those laws can be reduced to one very powerful, potent principle. And it's simply this, out of Galatians, is one expression of it. It's just that all the law can be reduced to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this principle, this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself is what is informing, it's kind of the backbone for the goal that we've set in front of you this year. That when we think about our country, when we think about what's deeply broken in the world, that one of the ways that Jesus wants us to get the answer to them, which is none other than Jesus Christ himself, like our relationship with God through Jesus Christ his Son, that is the answer that the world needs. That's what the country needs. That when Jesus says, how do we get that word out to people? He says one of the ways is that you learn to love your neighbor as yourself. That you love people, that you open doors for people where you can eventually share the good news of the gospel with people. And so our goal this year is kind of built around this idea of love where you live. In fact, let me give you the wording of this goal again. It's that we as a family of believers, and that's how we describe ourselves, we're a family of believers. And we're committed to two things, to love God vertically, to love our neighbors horizontally. That's who we are. That's who we're committed to being. And so as a family of believers committed to those things, we commit to something that we're going to be talking a lot about this year, love where you live. And we want to do that, as we studied last week, with the wisdom of grace and truth. Now, if you were with us last week, what we discovered in Colossians chapter 4 is that when Paul said, and when it comes to relating to people that are far away from God, when it comes to relating to what he called outsiders, people, maybe our neighbors, people who are far away from God, when it comes to relating to them, he says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, meaning that there is possibly a foolish way to do that, and there is a wise way. We pointed out that we would have expected him to say, walk in love toward those who are far away from God. But he says, walk in wisdom, emphasizing that there is a skill, there is a knowledge, there's some training that we need in order to relate to them the way that God wants us to. And so he goes on, and remember, he describes it as, hey, learn how to make the best use of your time. Because we're all busy people, but he says, like, hey, redeem your time, purchase some time, find some way to, make your time work so that you can, build relationships and friendships. And then he says, do so graciously. He uses this word graciously, and then he kind of qualifies it by saying that your speech would be seasoned with salt. Now, I'm kind of tempted to re-preach that message, but I need to not do that. But anyway, that's kind of what we learned last week. We're talking about like how to relate with the wisdom of grace and truth. That's kind of what our goal is. Now, this morning, what I would like to do is actually try to say, well, Danny, what is wisdom? What does the wisdom of grace and truth look like? I mean, how do we actually, somehow communicate grace and truth? What does that look like? Well, to answer that question, I invite you to turn to John chapter 1. Because Jesus, and one of the reasons why we love Jesus so much, is that he was the poster child. I mean, he was the only poster child there's ever been or ever will be about being full of grace and truth. And so in John chapter 1, John is going to begin his gospel with a prologue that basically introduces us to who Jesus is. And we're not going to look at all of this. We're going to primarily look at verses 14 through 19 or 18. But just look at the very beginning, just kind of glance down. In chapter 1, he begins with, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so in a moment, he's going to explain who the Word is, which is, of course, Jesus. But we learn right away that Jesus and the Father, like they exist together in all eternity past, along with the Holy Spirit. And so Jesus is God, the Word is God. And so you come down to verse 14, where we're going to begin looking in more detail. It says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, beginning right there, here's what I want to do. I just basically give you three things that are developed in the Gospel of John. First of all, John identifies Jesus as being full of grace and truth. So if you're into following along the notes on your outline, that's the first idea, that John, the author here, the writer, he identifies Jesus as full of grace and truth. He says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay, well, a couple of things that jump out at you from these verses is that, first of all, is that Jesus is God in the flesh. That the Word became flesh, that God who didn't quit, Jesus who didn't quit being God, he didn't give up being God, but he became flesh. In other words, flesh is sometimes used as just your body, that he took on a human body, but also flesh can sometimes be used of human nature. And Paul kind of confirms all this in Philippians chapter 2. And so what happens is Jesus, the perfectly God, adds this human flesh and human nature, so it becomes the God-man. And so he's God in the flesh, and also what we see is that the glory of the Father, he shares that, doesn't he? Because he is God. And so the glory of the only Son from the Father, the word in here is real specific. He's the one and only, he's the unique, one-of-a-kind Son of the Father who shares the glory of the Father. And then for our purposes this morning, we get this phrase that he's full of grace and truth. First thing that John does is identifies Jesus. What is the identity of Jesus? That Jesus is full of grace and truth. Now, we'll define those in just a moment, but just suffice it to say right now that of all the things that John might say in his prologue identifying Jesus, once he kind of, establishes the deity of Jesus, that he's God, is that he's full of grace and truth. Grace is repeated 4 times in this very short passage we're looking at. He's full of grace and truth. Second thing that we really find out about Jesus is that not only is he full of grace and truth, but from Jesus flowed grace and truth. From Jesus flowed grace and truth. This is his activity, we might say. Because he goes on, and we get a little parentheses here in verse 15, that John, talking about John the Baptist, who was introduced earlier in the chapter, John the Baptist bore witness about him, and he cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." And then John picks up, from his fullness, and this is the second time we see this idea of fullness or full. He says, from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. people wrestle a little bit with how to translate this because the preposition is a little bit weird. It's like grace against grace, or the idea of grace replacing grace. Some have attempted to illustrate it as like waves of the ocean. It's just grace upon grace, emanating from this one, Jesus. For from his fullness we have received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And so we have a little bit of a contrast here. Okay, so Moses, who for the Pharisees and the religious folks of the day, like Moses, man, he was, Moses. Man, you'd love to be in Moses' church because Moses, he was the guy. Moses, he said, brought the law. It was through Moses that the law is given to us from God. But he says that in contrast, grace and truth comes through Jesus, which causes you to kind of contrast the law through Moses to grace and truth. And now I want to try to define some of these terms. The significance of the law is that the law is very good as far as it goes. The law is really, really good as far as it goes. It's basically God's unsustainable or unreachable standards of holiness and righteousness. It's God's standards that no one has ever quite been able to live up to. And in response to that, to our great joy and relief, Jesus came full of grace and truth, who, with his death on the cross and the resurrection from the dead, that Jesus provided forgiveness for all of us for our failure to live up to the law. He gave us, by grace, this forgiveness from the penalty of sin. And also, by grace, power for freedom from sin. And so all of these are things that kind of come out of this idea of grace and truth. More specifically, I would suggest to you this. Grace is the idea of receiving fully undeserved benefits, favor, blessing. It's undeserved gifts of favor, of love, acceptance, blessing. Some have said GRACE is God's riches at Christ's expense. It's the idea of God giving to us things that we don't deserve and giving it to us freely through Jesus. That's grace. What is truth? Truth is basically, in John especially, is always revelation that communicates who God is and who we are as mankind and how God relates to man and man to God. Okay, so walking in the truth, or sometimes John would say walking in the light, is the idea of walking in agreement with what God has revealed about who he is. And what we learn from this passage is that's why Jesus came, is to make God known to us. No one has ever seen God, but God the Son, we're told here, has seen him and has made him known to us. Verse 18 says, no one has ever seen God. The only God who was at the Father's side, he has made him known. He uses the verb, he has exegeted God to us. When we want to know the Father, look at Jesus. When you want to know who Jesus is, look at the Word. Because it reveals to us who Jesus is, which, by the way, is what we're going to do this morning. Because having learned that Jesus was full of grace and truth, and that from Jesus flowed grace and truth, what happens now is that John moves to illustrate this in Jesus' life. And we're going to take the time, and hopefully we have time, to look at two illustrations from John's gospel where we see Jesus, this fullness of grace and truth, illustrated. So, having said all of that, I want you to turn first of all to John chapter 4. And we're going to look at what I would just call the story of the shunned woman. The story of the shunned woman. This is Woman at the Well. Many of you will be familiar with this passage. We're going to move through it really quick. I'm going to make some points. And what I want to do especially is for you to see how Jesus, full of grace and truth, puts this into practice with this woman. We pick up with verse 4. And we read here, and he had to pass through Samaria. And so he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. And a woman from Samaria came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, give me a drink. Now, let me just point out to you what's familiar already to many of you is that Jesus crosses several lines here when he addresses this woman. First of all, it's about noon. So it's in the kind of the heat of the day. The woman comes alone. Normally, she would be in the company of other women, but she's all alone. So you kind of get the idea that maybe she's shunned from the other community of women. They're alone. And we kind of find out perhaps why a little bit later in the passage. I want you to also notice that she's a Samaritan woman. Jesus is a Jew. So there was a real ethnic divide, wasn't there? There was a real ethnic break. There was a racial break between Jews and between Samaritans. And it kind of goes back to their history. And Samaritans were kind of now mixed Jewish race. And so those of pure Jewish blood would kind of back off from them. There was also a religious line that Jesus crosses here. Because as being a Samaritan, they had kind of twisted a couple of things about the law, about what Judaism taught, especially about where to worship and some of the other ceremonial law kind of things related to Old Testament life. And so there was a religious break. There was this cultural break. There was also this huge gender differences that a man, especially a rabbi, speaking to a woman, a Jew speaking to a Samaritan, there was this cultural break as well. Jesus crosses so many lines here in reaching out to this woman. So that's a significant thing. And so when you talk about what does grace look like, grace is always kind of communicates acceptance. It communicates love and care. And as we're going to see right now, grace is always kind of used to awaken the reality of spiritual thirst, of deeper questions about life. So when Jesus begins and asks for this favor, give me a drink, in this explanation, the disciples had gone away to the city to buy food. Verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? She's blown away by this. You know, when you love where you live, when you love this way, when you give grace, like grace you lead out with grace, that it does just kind of puzzle people sometimes. And she's puzzled by that. So John gives us this editorial comment, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And Jesus said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Now, you know, we understand what Jesus is saying, but she's not quite getting it yet. Okay, so she's thinking literal water, physical water. I've come to the well to draw water. And he says, okay, if you ask me for a drink, I'll give you living water. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get the living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock. And Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we talked about this last week when Paul said in Colossians chapter 4, he said, speak in ways that are gracious, full of salt. Remember, we talked about being salty saints. And we took from that the idea that you're trying to address and relate to people in a way that arouses in them thirst to hear about God. And what we see here is this exemplified in Jesus, who speaks very directly about her thirst. And what Jesus is trying to get at is her real longings for real love, real meaning, real purpose, to know God in a truthful way, honest, accurate way. And so he's doing this with her, and she's not quite getting it, but he's kind of aroused some interest. And the woman said to him, sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty and to have to come here to draw water. Now she's somewhat hooked. She's like, okay, I want that. Like when we talk about in our own personal God story, about what knowing Jesus has done for us, whether your story is about the peace of God, or it's about forgiveness and guilt being taken away, or it's about God helping you to repair broken relationships in your life, whatever it is, and you share that and you're kind of speaking to whatever thirst people have, because all of us thirst in those areas for love, meaning, purpose. And so she's interested in that. And the woman said, sir, give me this water. And Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. Now, for those of us, if you're reading for the first time, it just feels like something, just a left turn. Like, why now are you asking for this? And of course, Jesus goes on, or the woman answers, verse 17, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you are right in saying, I have no husband. For you have 5 husbands, you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true. And the woman said to him, well, sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Well, can't get anything past her. But I want you to see here that what Jesus is doing now is having kind of led out with grace, is that he's starting to now move with truth, and specifically the truth about who he is. So the whole thing about her husbands, that you may be tempted to think that what the point of Jesus' conversation is, I would like to scold you about the fact that you can't really get it right when it comes to love and marriage, like you sinner. That's not what Jesus is doing here. What Jesus is doing is trying to reveal who he is. So right now she thinks, okay, you're a prophet. Okay, you're someone who has inside knowledge about God. And so she's kind of growing in her awareness of who Jesus is, but it's not enough yet. And so the woman said, I perceive you're a prophet. Verse 20, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. And so he brings up all the stuff about her husbands and all, and she switches the subject. She moves to kind of like, well, what church should we go to? She talks about where to worship. Jesus says, look, it's not about where you worship. It's about who you worship. She says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews, truth. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Jesus is now really giving truth to her. And the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. And when he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And I would have just loved to have been there and watched her face. I mean, she kind of drops her jar. She's so taken back. Now, remember what truth is? Truth is when it's the revelation of who God really is and who we are and how we relate to each other. And so Jesus reveals who he is, specifically that he's the Messiah, that he's got insight into her life, and that how you worship God, how you connect with him. But he leads off graciously. So the grace here in this first illustration is Jesus' acceptance and awakening. He accepts her and awakens thirst in her. The truth is he reveals who he is and how to relate to God. Now, so much more that we could say about that, but I want you to see grace and truth with this woman, this shunned woman. Second, though, I want to give you another illustration. I want you to turn to John chapter 8, and we're going to look at what I would call the shameful woman. The shameful woman. Now, as you're making your way to John chapter 8, I need to make a quick comment here that you'll see a note in your Bible that basically communicates that this passage we're going to look at, there's some concern or question about whether it was really part of the original writing of the Gospel of John. And so what's going on is that when the New Testament writings when they were written, that people made many copies of them, which basically produced thousands and thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament writings. Some 24,000 manuscripts, okay, either in full or partial of the New Testament. When it comes to the Gospel of John, the earliest of these manuscripts don't contain the passage that we're going to look at, though the majority of the manuscripts of the Gospel of John do contain it. All right? So the very earliest don't contain it, but the majority of the manuscripts of John do contain it. Isn't that interesting? Now, there are some early readings that do contain it, but the earliest readings don't. Now, textual critics, those who work hard to look at all the Greek manuscripts to determine, okay, what was the original, what was clearly the original writing, that they place more weight on the early manuscripts than they do on the majority of manuscripts or the number of manuscripts. And that leads them to question whether this passage was originally part of John's writing. So what's the truth? Well, scholarship is somewhat divided on it, though the majority of scholars would say it probably was not original to John. I don't know. I can't say definitively. I will say this, that if it wasn't original, I do believe that it's historical. Because when you read through it, it just rings with truth about who Jesus is. It's real consistent with how Jesus responds to the Pharisees who are trying to trap him, as is the case here. And that, it had a long, early oral tradition associated with it. But we just don't know if it was original, but I do believe it's historical. One other thing, very quickly, at the very end of John's Gospel, we do get this comment, which I think is very interesting. At the very last verse of the Gospel of John says this, "Now, there are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." So I think that we all get that, right? We get the fact that Jesus' 33 years was full of stuff, and the Gospels can't capture everything. And this may very well be one of those things that perhaps wasn't original at the time of John, but was historical. So I think it's hugely instructive for us. And so having said that, let me read through here. This is now not the shunned woman, but the shameful woman. We pick up chapter 8, verse 1, and it says, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, now, let's just say right off the bat that the setting is Jesus is teaching. It's a public forum. These Pharisees and scribes, those who were really against Jesus and his teaching, they were the religious leaders of the day. They were not happy with Jesus. They're trying to trap him and undermine his leadership. And it says that they bring this woman caught in adultery. Interestingly, that they don't bring the guy. There is good reason to believe that the Pharisees and scribes have set this whole thing up, and that they're complicit in that sense. But anyway, they bring her before Jesus, and they're going to make the point that the law, the Old Testament law under Moses, demanded that she would be executed, stoned to death. So as we resume reading, it says, they bring this woman caught in adultery, placing her in the midst. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. And Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and speaks to them. Now, let me just say, what in the world is Jesus doing? He stoops down and he's writing on the ground. Well, we can't really go much further than what the passage says, but we can speculate, okay? So we don't know this for sure, but Jesus bends down and he's writing in the dirt. And it's very possible that the one, God himself, who wrote the law, remember how the 10 Commandments written by the hand of God, the finger of God, like the very God, Jesus, who begins writing, the author of the law, could very well, be writing something like, "You shall not falsely accuse your brother." He could have been just writing, signifying that here is the one, that God himself, the author of the law, that is now writing. And so he stands up and he says to these men, he says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And then once more he bent down and wrote on the ground, which I just find just incredible. Jesus doesn't stare him down. Because it's a pretty convicting thing to say. He stoops back down and is writing. Perhaps he's writing down, by 2 or 3 witnesses shall every accusation be made. And in this powerful moment, all these ready to stone this woman just began dropping the stones. And once more, he bent down, wrote on the ground, but when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." Now, I wish we had the rest of the data on these passages. I know that scares you, but let's just suffice it to say that when you talk about Jesus full of grace and truth, one of the things to take note of is that Jesus does not condemn her. He says, "Woman, where are your accusers? Where are those who would condemn you? Neither do I condemn you." And then what's followed is the truth. Then when it comes to rightly relating to God, she says, listen, he says to her, "Go and sin no more." And I would suggest to you the order here is very, very important. Because too many of us would say, "Hey, lady, quit sinning," while you feel my condemnation and my judgment. And Jesus says, "Neither do I condemn you." That's what Jesus does. That's what we love about Jesus, is that he builds a relationship with us just where we are. He accepts us right where we are, no matter how messed up we are. He starts with us by accepting us, gives us life, gives his life to pay for our sin. And that when we're blown away by the grace of God and what he did for us, Jesus says, "Now that you have forgiveness, go and sin no more." Oh my goodness. Don't we love Jesus because of this? He's full of grace and grace and truth flowed from him. And that's what we see again with this woman. And I bet you have stories that you could tell of how people expressed grace and the acceptance of God's love, and how that postured you and invited you and awoke within you a desire to want to know God at a deeper level. And then you were ready to hear truth, and that truth messes with your whole belief system and changes your belief. I think from time to time I've told you the story, and I'm going to repeat it again, that a huge, huge scene in my life was when I was in high school. I had heard the gospel and responded, but I wasn't walking with God. I wasn't really pursuing God. I didn't have real clarity about God. And I remember I was driving 12 miles into Conroe, from where I lived, where the Woodlands is now. It wasn't there when I was growing up, but we'd drive 12 miles into town, and on Friday nights, I had a friend, this girl who wanted, when I drove into Conroe, wanted to bum a ride, and every Friday night, I would take her to this home belonging to Larry and Linda Albritton, and would drop her off for this Bible study. This guy had a couple hundred high school students meeting in his house on Friday nights for this Bible study. And I'd just drop her off, and I would go partying with my friends. And that was kind of a Friday routine. That's what you did on Friday night. Saturday was a date night, but Friday night you went and partied with your friends. And I would drop her off at this place, and and then after the night's over, I'd go over there, and she'd be outside waiting, and I'd pick her up, and then we'd drive back home. And that went on for a really long time. And on one particular occasion, I went to pick her up after the night was over, and she wasn't outside, and I was a little miffed, but so I had to go to the door and knock, come in, and so I'm there, and it's late, and most of the students are gone. But I walk in there, and I meet this guy, Larry Albritton, and and I don't know what happened, but for some reason I had to bend down to pick something up, and when I did, the Schlitz beer cap rolled out of my pocket. Kind of bounced around on the carpet. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. I'm about to catch it. He picked that thing up and go, whoa, what is this? He was laughing. It was the complete opposite of what I expected. He put his arm around my neck and said, well, have been having fun tonight? And I mean, he responded just so lovingly, so gracious. That after that night, I would still, same thing, Friday night I'd come in, but I'd come to pick her up a little bit earlier. And so I could go in there and, just say hey. And after a while getting to know this guy, to make this story short, I started just coming with her to the Bible study. And this man's grace prepared me to hear the truth of God's Word. That's what happened. It's unbelievable. And so when you come to the last part of here, just by way of application, this third point, it's obviously that John, from what we've learned, is that we are to imitate a Jesus full of grace and truth. Like, this is who we're to be. We are to be Jesus to our neighbors and to all who are far away from God. That we too would be full of grace and truth. So let me just flesh that out. Number one is that we need to accept and awaken thirst with grace. We need to accept people, no matter where they are, what their political persuasion is, what their sexual orientation is, what their belief is toward the church, whether they're just not fun, lovely people. We need to accept and love people, to lead with grace, and see how that opens doors for later to also get to truth kind of issues. Let me just try to give you a couple of examples of this. And this may not work for you because, you have to factor all this through your personality and what's comfortable. But like, there are issues, right, that routinely come up when we're out there interacting with people who are far away from God. For example, in the whole area of politics, which is kind of a hot button as we go into the political season, and people want to talk about, why they're Democrat or why they're Republican or why they're Libertarian and what their view is on one issue or another. In the midst of that, you can jump in there and just kind of, dig it up with everybody. Or I think a gracious segue is something like this, where I might say, some political positions make more sense to me than others for sure. But bottom line is, I don't believe that there is a political solution that addresses the really deepest problems for humankind. Now, I think that invites someone to say, well, what do you think are the deepest problems? Or that has a way of disarming the idea that you're not trying to argue political positions here. You're trying to say, as helpful as they may be, and some may make more sense to you than others, but basically, there's not a political solution to the deep problem of man's heart. And something like this opens the door for further dialogue where you can start getting into truth. That until we're right with God, we'll never be right with each other. And until you have men and women of Christ-like character, I don't care what economic system that you subscribe to, the depravity of man corrupts everything. And what we desperately need are people to understand that God loves them and wants to connect with them. Okay, let's talk about sexuality. Obviously, a lot of conversations about sexuality. And in the midst of that, when maybe people are pushing you for like, what do you think about all this? If I'm talking to people who are far away from God, I want to say something like this. Personally, I think that whole matter of sexuality is really hugely complex. But most important is I think that many of us wrongly trust in sex or romantic love as a means for the life that we really want. And I just don't think that they really address that. that no matter what your orientation is or whatever your interest, is that when we try to fill up our lives, when we try to find the kind of ideal life and meaning and purpose, like it's beyond those things. Again, that's a gracious way because it's non-condemning. It's not, let me argue with you. It's that, hey, there's a deeper issue here. It's like if I was standing around the water cooler on Monday and people want to talk about what happened in Oregon. It's that even though there may be wisdom on both sides of the whole gun law debate, I don't want to talk about that. I want to say, I think, to me, that there's something wrong, there's something broken in the soul of our country that's deeper than what any gun law debate can address. That's where we want to talk. Let me give you one more. When it comes to science, and that people typically believe that the church or believers are anti-science, and people struggle with that, and some feel like really, needed to defend and all. I would say something like, I don't think faith and science are incompatible at all. I think that many times that science can inform faith and that faith can inform science, especially addressing issues that science can never answer. Issues like love and meaning and purpose, and the huge problems of evil in our world, in the reality of death. That you kind of move to the discussion at a whole different way, trying to stir thirst for the things that people really care about, instead of the more shallow, where we tend to argue and push against each other. So we need to accept people and awaken in our dialogue with them to try to lead off in ways that would surprise them. That opens up opportunities for sharing grace, for sharing truth. Second, we need to address thirst with truth. We need to address thirst with truth. Grace opens the door for thirst. Thirst opens the door for truth. When you start talking to truth, truth impacts beliefs, which then inspire behavior. Right beliefs lead to right behavior. When we just jump to behavior in a condemning tone, we do nobody service. We lead off with grace, love, acceptance, then truth about beliefs like who God is, and then those beliefs, God takes over. He produces the behavior. All right, let me just say, by way of closing here, that, listen, you've got to get involved. If you want to learn how to love where you live, you have got to get involved. I want you to be in a small group. If you haven't signed up for a small group yet, I want you to get into a small group, because that's where we're going to learn to love where we live. So we're going to study this exciting material called Art of Neighboring, and it's going to be helpful because you're with a learning community, a group of people, and you're all learning together, like what does this look like, and how do we do this? And so if you haven't signed up, you can do that online. You can go to our information desk out here, call our office. We'll help you get connected. I also want you to know, when it comes to this Art of Neighboring, that next week we're starting a very exciting study through the book of Acts. And for the first 6 weeks or so, we're calling it the Acts of Neighboring. And so that starts next Sunday. I want you to know that. Second is, this is Neighbor Night Out this week. This is a great launch. Get out there and meet some neighbors. Neighbor Night Out this week.